Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing a 25.18 top lane tier list. So if you enjoy content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. We are beginning to go towards the worlds cycle patches, so we're not actually going to see as many of the solo queue centric changes as we have in the last two patches. So this patch we saw a buff towards Jace. We've also seen a slight nerf towards Aurora, alongside some other things which just aren't performing as well as Riot want them to. I've removed some champions from the tier list. Some of them were just not that popular or only really cater towards a very niche audience, and I think a tier list placement doesn't really do the champion that kind of justice, so I've just opted into removing them for the moment, but I'll add them back if they gain a decent chunk of their player, or a decent chunk of players incoming onto the champion. So let's get into it. The D tier is going to lead off with Xin Zhao now. So Xin Zhao obviously gained a bunch of players with the ASU he received, a fresh set of paint, made the champion feel a lot nicer to a lot of people to play, and overall he can work as a top laner. I wouldn't recommend it. He can struggle if he ever falls behind. He feels really bad. He kind of relies on just stat checking the enemy, being able to just E forward them and just auto and knock people down through that kind of play pattern. And I think if you fall behind or you're just not able to get the advantages in lane, the champion does struggle quite a bit. I don't really recommend him in the top lane. Jungle Xin Zhao is a pretty good champion as of the moment, and that is just the place where I would recommend playing him. Udyr has not been supported in the top lane for a while now. Both AP and AD Udyr are in a pretty bad spot. AD especially just looks numbers wise really weak. It relies on kind of you already being on the target to do all your damage, and one of Udyr's biggest constraints is just being able to get onto the targets which you want within the fight without either being peeled off or just the movement within the game kind of denying him from having that level of access. So what I think is a counter pick can be fine, but I wouldn't recommend him unless you're an OT, not an OTP, but someone who's put a lot of time into the champion at some point. I think you need to be comfortable on him, and if you're just not comfortable, then he's a pick which I just not even recommend considering. And then Gwen as the other champion within the D tier. I could bump her back up to the C tier. I think she could perfectly reasonably be a C tier champion, but I want to emphasize that I just don't really recommend the champion anymore. I think the pick's been pretty heavily nerfed, and it's unfortunate to see because she's already player base wise sat towards the lower end of the main pool of top lanes, which I don't know, Riot have massively failed with this update. I think they should just do a full revert, because right now the champion's in a really bad state for just general audiences. Into the C tier, then we lead off with Yone. Yone's been a pretty bad spot for a while now. I still think if you can get ahead and you pick him in the right matchups, you can get value out of the champion. I think Yone with items and gold can be quite good, but he has a similar issue to Graves right now. Graves' issue is that he's just so gold heavy. You have to put so many resources into the champion to get a lot out of it, and oftentimes that just isn't really worth it, especially in a top laner or as a jungler, where I think you either want to work on a lower budget and be able to kind of give your resources to other people, or as a top laner in a lot of situations you might not get the help which you need consistently, and that can definitely hurt. So you have to forge your own needs a lot of times, and a lot of those times you will struggle because other people, the other top laner, might not just give you those advantages for free. Cassandra, have him in the C tier. I don't recommend Cassandra for solo queue. He's a good stonewall and good early to mid game champion, on your chain vest spike and on your ice spawn spike, and then whatever item you usually go to follow that up with, whether that's an unending, or you can be a bit more flexible usually. Then I think Cassandra can be quite strong in those, but he has the issue where if the game timer goes too long, he feels really unreliable, and it's pretty hard to do a huge amount to decide your fate. You kind of put your fate in the hands of your other teammates, which can be fine. I think the higher up you go the ladder is honestly you can expect to have consistency in that, but if you're not comfortable with the champion, or you're not comfortable giving up some of that agency, I think there are just better options. And Cassandra is a hard champion to pilot. If you're just not comfortable with the pick, I just recommend other things over him. Jace, I'm gonna leave him in the C tier at the moment. I think you could argue he's easily a B tier pick. The main issue I have with Jace is if you don't exploit the buff, then the champion is the same for the most part. And Jace as a pick, you need to be able to pilot his early game really well. And most players, even Master, 2GM players, will not utilize the fact that this champion has an incredibly strong laning phase, but it's incredibly punishing at the same time. If you ever fall behind on this pick, you will really struggle. He won't be able to like stay on the curve, and won't be able to dish out the damage you kind of need to as like a champion like Jace, because of kind of what he wants to provide to your team. I think if you want to put time to him, that's perfectly reasonable. The buff this patch is really huge, especially in elite and competitive. Like, I think this is completely the wrong buff to give to Jace. Like, Jace wasn't far off in comp, especially with like other things being nerfed around him. And a buff like this, I wouldn't be surprised if this just makes him like a tier, like a tier 2 at least pick. Maybe even tier 1. Maybe he gets prioed as high as Rumble. I'll be interested to see. But this is a really big buff and definitely not the right direction, because Jace historically struggles more in solo queue than competitive, and I think if they just buffed him for solo queue, he would generically gain some of that like priority in competitive. Gangplank, I have him in the C tier. I think if you can pilot him really well, he can be rewarding, but he you do have to pilot him well, and I think he has issues with his build and like keystones. I think it can definitely feel quite punishing not having a particularly like tailored rune, I guess you could say. Like Grasp was kind of that, but they've really heavily nerfed Grasp for Gangplank at this point, and he definitely struggles a lot more with like the current rune setup, where that's like your comets. Some people still go Grasp. I don't think you should. Fleet seems to be something which like floats around a bit. Same with First Strike. But yeah, the pick definitely struggles with some of his keystones at the moment, and I think that can definitely be a markdown. Like alongside the fact that he's already a very hard champion to pilot, I think he has limitations as a pick at the moment. Kayn seems to have landed as a C tier pick. I was pretty much bang on with that. The mana cost changes were nice. It allows him to like standard lane a bit better rather than just being forced into proxim, because you just don't have the mana to consistently fight. I think he gives him more options, and yeah, I'd say if you're comfortable playing Kayn, he's like a legitimate top laner now, like a top lane option. If you're not comfortable playing Kayn, I don't think you need to play him. He just sits as like a C tier option at the moment. Trundle, I might bump down to the D tier. Trundle's really not performing well in the top lane at the moment. I've run into Kagaru and Alois playing Trundle, and they struggled. Like I think the pick's definitely like it's been hit quite hard with that W nerf. I think it was more top lane nerfed, if anything, with that W change. And yeah, like if you're like some of the best players on EU West are just not having quite the success on the champion, I think it is definitely struggling. But obviously this isn't tailored towards high elo. I think even in low elo, like this pick definitely has limitations. And right now, I think I would just recommend other things over him. It's just not a particularly good state for Trundle to be in the top lane at the moment. Tahm Kench and Gnar wrap up the C tier. Tahm Kench has obviously been nerfed like a long time ago at this point, and it's just sat as like a below average pick. I just don't really recommend Tahm Kench at the moment. He needs so much gold to be as valuable as he was in previous iterations, and as a tank in the top lane, you just won't usually get access to that unless the person on the other side of the rift just like freely like hands over like a lot of resources to you. So yeah, Tahm Kench just a pick I wouldn't really recommend at the moment. And then Gnar, I don't think Gnar's in the greatest state. He definitely also suffered from Grasp being nerfed. For ranged champions, most people go Fleet on him these days, and that does look to be correct. There are some different build variations I've seen, like, you're always going Trinity. That one's without a doubt. But there's been things like Sterix, Cleaver, we've seen like Jackshow Thirds, Deadman's Thirds. I've like experimented with some of these. And I do think Sterix traditionally is just going to be your best second item option. It's really nice for him, gives you like a lot of extra health to work with, especially in Mega. And yeah, I think it also denies you in a lot of situations from just being bursted down, which can be quite valuable on a pick like this. I think you should only really use him as a counter pick. I don't think Gnar Blind's particularly good. I think there's a lot of champions and OTPs which, if you run into, can just like blast you in the right matchups. Like your Aurelio OTPs, for example, can be really punishing if you don't ban the champion. So yeah, I'd have him as a C tier as like a counter pick option at the moment. Moving on to the B tier, then we lead off with Silas, who I think as a counter pick is fine. Like, use him as an answer to like your Gnars and your Malphites, and that can be quite valuable. But generally, he's like fine as an option in the top lane. I think it just comes down to finding the matchups which suits you. Tryndamere, I have him in the B tier at the moment. He's also just like a fine top lane option. I don't think he's in the greatest state, but he's also in a really degenerate state at the moment. And we've seen people take him into the mid lane. We've seen people take him into the jungle. Overall, I think the kit, definitely. Like, I think Trindam is definitely one of the top 5 champions in the game right now, which needs some sort of kit overhaul or just changes, because, like, the current play pattern is just not that healthy for the game, and I feel like Riot might just nerf him at some point, purely because they don't feel, well, they don't want to support this kind of play pattern. Yasuo, I remember beat it. I think he's a perfectly reasonable counter pick. I wouldn't recommend blinding him. I think there's a lot of top laners which you can definitely struggle into. But if you like know some of the range matchups which you want to take him into, and you feel comfortable with that, or you find the right compositions you want to run him alongside, I think he's a perfectly reasonable B tier pick at the moment. Varus and Vayne obviously are champions which can really hurt your team composition depending on like when you take them, like when like what stage you pick them. That being said though, I think as counter picks and just general lane bullies, they can be really powerful options. So I think don't blame them, albeit most people who play these champions probably will blame them because they traditionally end up being like OTP'd like in the top lane, but just find like the spots you're comfortable playing them and then understand kind of like what your responsibility is within the game. And I think they can be valuable, but I would only really recommend them as counter pick options for the most part, because there are games where they will just be bad and you will just be punished for playing these kinds of champions. Camille, I think as a counter pick could be fine. She's not in the greatest of states, but I also don't think she's unplayable at the moment. There are definitely spots where Camille can be quite powerful as an option. If the enemy has poor tools to deal with you on sides, if you have a lane matchup which you know you can either punish or just like freely scale through, that can be good spots to play Camille for the most part. Ambessa, really good champion. Always recommend learning Ambessa. I think she's one of the best picks in the game to sink time into. That being said, she just doesn't perform that well for average play. Makes sense. She's an elite skewed champion. There's a couple of those within the game. I say couple, a decent chunk of those within the game. And I think she just fills that kind of space where doesn't perform as well for average play, but performs pretty well for elite. She's always been one of the top like S, even like S plus options there, and I would recommend learning her at some point. Nasus is fine. I don't think he's in the greatest of states, but he's definitely a champion where if you can get him in a good counter pick situation, he can have genuine value. So I do have him in the B tier at the moment. Ornn, I really dislike. I think there are pretty clear issues with Ornn's kit. He loses to a lot of the top lane pool at the moment, and unless people are providing you with the like openings to find all-in angles or just playing kind of poorly around your kit, I really think it's hard to kind of punish people as this champion, and you are at the mercy of your team a lot of the time. I think there are a lot of better tank options over him, so I don't rate him that highly. I kind of just have him as like a mid B tier pick. Honestly, I could even have him as like a mid to low end B tier pick at the moment. I really think he's definitely in not one of his like greatest states. Gragas, I think he's a fine B tier option. If you understand how to like utilize his kit, understand the matchups you want to take him into, I think he can be a genuinely solid option. Not quite the same immovable pick as he has been in previous iterations. I think that's pretty clear at this point. He has a pretty weak laning phase until you get access to like your Lost Chapter and some of your like other components, so you have a better time clearing the wave and you can trade back a bit more effectively. Plus the fact that like your sustain's definitely a lot weaker. Like it used to be 8%, it's now like 5 or even 4.5, I'm pretty sure. So yeah, Gragas definitely not the same champion as he has been in previous iterations, but sits as a pretty solid B tier option. Riven, I mean, I wouldn't recommend her outside of being like if you're like an OTP. So I think her placement's kind of like whatever on the tier list. It can completely adjust depending on like how much time you put into this champion. Like she's a must avoid if you don't have time in her. If you're very comfortable on her, she can comfortably still be an A and like compete with like the S tier champions. It literally just comes down to how much time you have on the pick. Darius, I have him in the beta. He's really not been performing that well for average play for a while now. I understand there's like spots where I think he's pretty solid, like there are utilizing him as a counter pick or understanding when you can really push an advantage and kind of take over the game. I think he can have agency in that regard. He's definitely more elite skewed at the moment. I mean, Darius for a long time now has been elite skewed, so that is just something you have to consider when like picking a champion, but you have to be able to get something out of his early game, otherwise he will just struggle a bit more later on at the moment. Volibear, have him in the B tier. He doesn't put out as good numbers top lane as he does in jungle. Like, Volibear top actually puts out pretty bad numbers, if anything. That being said, I think people build him incorrectly in a lot of games, and I think there's a lot more flexibility than people like are kind of opting into. Like, there's still a lot of Royal Volibear, and Cosmic looks really good on him still. I mean, Cosmic Jungle Volibear has been really good for a while now. I think even like Cleaver Volibear has been in a pretty good spot, but most people will choose not to opt into that because obviously, like, in a lot of situations, the AP items have been more performant. I'm going to leave him in the beta at the moment because I think in certain matchups he can just stat check and be really obnoxious and hard to kind of deal with. But he definitely lost power this patch with the nerf towards his like attack speed AP ratio on the passive. Aurora, I'm going to leave her in the beta, maybe a low beta option now. Lost some early game power, gained back some late. It looks to be net negative, if anything. So, yeah, I'm going to have her a bit lower down. I think she, like, in the top lane still remains as, like, a pretty solid counterpick option. I think if you blind her, there are definitely matchups you could struggle quite a bit into on this champion. Rise, I'm leaving him in the beta. I've run into a lot of Rise tops recently. It's kind of weird, like in this like mid to high master kind of territory. There's actually just a lot of Rise OTPs on EU West. That being said, it can be quite obnoxious. Like I think Rise top is genuinely a pretty good pick, especially going into Elite. For average play, he sits as more like a B tier option in both mid and top. Like, I would even be willing to say, like, top lane Rise might be better than mid lane Rise in some, in a decent chunk of his situations, actually. So, it's just something to consider. Like, if you want to put time into Rise, I think he's a genuine option in the top lane. That being said, though, he's not, like, mandatory. I only have him in the B tier at the moment, kind of on that reason. Malphite, I'm in the B tier. Malphite's a weird one, because, like, Malphite excels in the Elo bracket. Utilizing him as a counter pick, he's an easy to play tank option. Yeah, that's like should be one of like the core reasons for it. The problem is he doesn't have flexibility. Like you are usually just bound to like your tank build. You can opt into AP items. It traditionally ends up being weaker because you are sacrificing some level of your tankiness for a bit of agency, and that agency usually comes at the cost of you're just not the same level of frontline. That being said, though, I don't think it's bad to opt into Malignance in some games. Like, you do want to have agency in certain situations, especially when your team is just not putting, like performing quite as well as maybe you hoped they would. The problem is, Malphite is just a low agency tank, and the kind of concern, at least I have with some of the kind of, like, top lane shapes at the moment, is, like, these counterpick options. If you are counterpicking with a tank, you usually feel quite bad about it, because you want to have a counterpick which has agency. You want to be able to stomp your matchup, and then be able to, like, stomp the game, and I just don't think that is, like, I think that's more rewarding than opting into a tank at the moment and just stonewalling, because you just end up relying on your team in a lot of situations. Wukong, pretty solid B tier top laner. I think he's more like a, I mean, he's like towards the high end of the B tier. He's just there. I mean, he's obviously mostly played by OTPs, and you're not really going to see him outside of that. But I think it's just a general counter pick to some of the AD boosters in the top lane. He's pretty solid, and he can definitely fight back against a lot of them pretty comfortably. Moving up from the B to the A tier, then we've got two champions, and that is Cassiopeia and Garen. Cassiopeia looks really good. The buff was huge this patch. Plus 50 mana baseline combined with 12 damage on the E, like also but like also plus 12 damage, so it's like I don't remember what the baseline value is, but it's 100 to 112 on like the level 9 E on like the empowerment, which is huge, by the way. That is so much damage to gain on this champion. I really think people should probably start looking at Cassiopeia top and mid again as like a good counterpick option, because the buffs were really big, and she is meaningfully stronger with them. So Cassiopeia gonna bump up to the A tier. It's a pretty solid high-end A tier option even. Zac doing fine. Obviously only going to really be played by like your OTPs. Outside of that, he kind of just sits as like a middle of the pack tank option in the top lane. It really comes down to like understanding how to utilize your blobs to kind of maintain and sustain throughout your lane, and then utilizing your E later on to the game to find like angles to win the game more than anything. I think that is kind of like the value of the champion at the moment. The ghosting change is nice though. Is meaningful, does actually give him some power. It's not a fake change. That combined with like Sunfire being buffed, I think he probably sits as more like a legitimate like mid, even maybe high end A tier option at the moment. Actually probably like sits above the bar for like a decent chunk of the tank pool. Aurelia I have in the A tier, and honestly I put like Fiora next to her. These champions, I think if you pilot them well, are incredible options. They are so strong if you've put the time into them. I think if you haven't put the time into them, they look really, really bad. Like, you need to, like, I can't emphasize enough, like, how much putting time into these kind of picks matters. Like, the difference between your 10th game on these champions and, like, your 100th game on these champions is going to be so meaningful. So, I think you have to, like, if you haven't already put the time into them, you have to put time into them. Probably not on main, like, you should practice them elsewhere. Like, you should never put these champions straight onto main. But if you've got, like, your 100 game mark, you understand, like, why you're picking these champions. They are really, really good options and very deserving of an A, even, like, S tier pick in a lot of situations. Clyde sits in the A tier. He's definitely sacrificed a lot of his damage for durability. Like, current iteration of Clyde is like the dismount remount like thing. It's quite funny because he does have access to a lot more HP. But he is also not gonna do the same level of damage. He's definitely lost agency in that regard. And overall, I think it's allowed his win rate to sit higher, which is quite funny to see because people just aren't as frustrated by the champion anymore. But yeah, you're definitely like. You have to understand like how the play patterns change because it is meaningful in like the damage loss on this champion. Poppy sits in the A tier. I think as a counter pick she's good. I think outside of counter pick scenarios I just wouldn't recommend her though. Maybe she should be a B tier option. I'll like reconsider it going into next patch. But she's I think in the right spot still a very good pick. So yeah, I'm gonna leave her here for the moment. Rumble, I managed to miss. He is still in the B tier at the moment. This pick for Elite is like still really good, and for tier 1 play or like for competitive, he is still like tier 1 top laner. He is like the definitive best option now, with like the Gwen nerfs being very sizable. It seems like people are just going down the Rumble route. I expect they will nerf him in 25.19. I kind of don't want to see a Rumble meta at Worlds, considering it's been a Rumble meta for almost the entirety of the year now in competitive. But for solo queue, he's actually in one of the best spots he's been in. Sits in the B tier at the moment for average play, and seems to be a pretty solid pick if you want to access like a good AP damage option with a very powerful ultimate and a pretty hard to assail lane. Alawi got buffed this patch. The buff, or like adjusted, the changes ended up being net positive though. That's kind of why I'm like hinting at it was being at it as being a bit of a buff. I believe it ended up being slightly low MMR skewed for the change, which is I think, I mean, she's already a pretty low MMR skewed champion. Like, I wouldn't really recommend maining Alawi unless you are like fine with the fact that she just doesn't convert that well into high MMR brackets. But the champion is definitely in a pretty solid spot at the moment, so I do have her in the A tier. Carly, and honestly, I'll like once again pull the AP champions together. Kennen, Teemo, like I think in the right spots, and Vladimir actually. I think in the right spots, if you pick any of these champions, they can be really good. Traditionally, they're champions which are like really rewarding if you've put a decent chunk of time into, like your high middingers, for example. Like if you understand how to like play the lane out with this champion and where the burst comes on this pick, like even like some of the interactions with like jungle camps. I think this pick has a lot of depth to him, which is quite important to like master and understand. For Carly, I think she's a pretty good counter pick in the top lane, and for like an AP assassin, she's quite nice to just have within your pool. Kennen is a very slept on champion, has been for a long time now. I think in the right counter matchups, he can also be really effective. Teemo, still a really good option in low MMR brackets. You traditionally play around your shrooms because you want to, because traditionally the game's going to go longer, and having power within your streams is really valuable in that space. The higher up you go, the more your lane matters, and being able to just bully people out and then kind of convert that into advantages is really, really powerful. Vladimir, I also think, as like a counter pick, is a really nice top laner. It's really hard to assail him at the moment. He's been in a pretty good spot with like a bunch of the mage item buffs not too long ago, and is a very deserving A tier option. Some of your other A tier picks include the likes of Yorick, who actually has maintained a decent competitive presence. It's really nice to see, because I think that was it's weird because it's the champion ended up kind of like, that wasn't the goal of the change. The goal of the change was to, I believe, make the ghouls feel a bit more powerful, and like give him a bit more agency within his kit. So the ghouls are harder to kill. The Q now hits a lot harder, I believe in it, or not, maybe not harder, but like gives him a bit more like trading power for like the HP return on it. Anyway, like I think Yorick as a champion is at a pretty good spot just across the board, and I think if you want to put time into him, he can be quite rewarding in his current state. Pantheon sits within the A tier. I still think top lane is like his third best role. Like, you should probably play mid, jungle, then top. But if you want to play top lane Pantheon, I think he's fine as an option. Maybe he's not a high A tier pick. Maybe I should have him towards the lower end of the A tier. But he's definitely been like pretty okay for a while now. So yeah, I'd have him in the A tier as of the moment. Aatrox, someone in my last video wrote in the comments that they don't think Aatrox is particularly good, which is surprising, but then I looked at the data, and actually, like, people have moved away from Sundered Sky again, which is, like, really surprising, because Sundered Sky Aatrox is good, like, really good, and people still play that in comp alongside Grass, but then you look at the data for solo queue, people are playing Conqueror Eclipse, it doesn't look as good, which is really surprising to see. So, I recommend playing Sundered Sky with Grass. I think in a lot of situations it is the best way to play him. But he does have flexibility. You can play like your Profanes, you can play your Eclipses. I believe there's more options there. Like, Aatrox does have the flexibility in builds at the moment if you do want to opt into more burst or into more durability. But Sundered Sky, Stark is always going to be my recommended default way of playing the champion. Pair alongside a Grasp, and you can still go Conqueror even with this. And I still, like, the champion's in a good state. I just think people play him, like, or build him incorrectly in a lot of those scenarios. Warwick, I have him in the A tier. He genuinely lost power with the changes not too long ago. The move of 5 magic damage on hit to, I believe it was 5 base AD. Or was it 6 magic? I don't remember the specific numbers, but it was a meaningful nerf because he lost sustain. He lost like damage early on to the game, even if he gained back that like in the mid game and like into the late game. Doesn't matter as much because Warwick top lane like cares a lot more about his early game than Warwick jungle. Warwick jungle doesn't like suddenly scale better, but like you get through the first levels of Warwick jungle through just clearing camps. Warwick top, you are trading with the enemy top laner. Quinn in a really good spot. The profane buffs were massive for her. I genuinely think as an option she is like maybe even borderline S tier. Like, I might bump her up next patch. I'm kind of considering it. But she, yeah, with the profane buffs really performing quite well at the moment. Definitely a champion not to sleep on in her current state. Garen, I'm putting him at the top of the A tier. The buff this patch didn't actually look that meaningful on paper, but ended up being really, really huge for the champion. Like, gaining damage on Garen, like, actually opens up more kill angles than, like, it just gives him like the ability to actually kill targets more consistently, which is like a really big change for the champion because that was like one of the things he was missing at the moment. Like, Garen wasn't quite able to get people to VR like ignite execute threshold, and now that he's able to do it a bit more consistently, yeah, I think he's a genuinely pretty solid option again. I would once again recommend trying Garen and like giving him a go because he seems like a legitimate option now. Some of your other picks within the A tier include the likes of Mundo, who I think is a counter pick, is a very, very powerful option. If you can get through laning phase, get to like your 1-2 item spikes, he is an incredibly good juggernaut. He's been in a pretty solid spot for a while now. Just don't mind him. I think he's a lot of matchups which he can definitely struggle into, and you are giving up some of your early game agency when you are opting into him. Cho'Gath and Shen, 2 other tanks I have in the A tier at the moment. I think Cho'Gath's been in a really good state for a while now. Really hard to move in lane, scales really well, really nice pick in that regard. Think Shen, if you pick him alongside like a hyper carry on your team, it's really effective, wins most lanes early game. Obviously he struggles like once people get access to ultimates because this ultimate is a non-combat ultimate. And it like doesn't give him like solo power to like fight back in lane, so that is just something to consider. But early on, if you are able to get ahead of the curve, if you are able to get an early Titanic, he is a very powerful champion. Definitely like find the right spots to play him, and I think you can do quite well at the moment. Renekton and Jax are my other 2 A tier picks. I think they probably aren't quite the top of the A tier at the moment, albeit they're still really good options. Jax in the right matchups, his Counter-Strike is an incredibly powerful tool. Renekton is just like a really solid jack of all trades, hard to move in lane, really powerful ultimate, doesn't even scale badly these days. His W is a really powerful point-to-click CC ability, just a lot of tools you really want in a top lane champion. So yeah, also going to be an A tier pick. I'd recommend trying Stridebreaker. I think defaulting on Eclipse can definitely like hurt in some matchups. And Stridebreaker, I think, is a pretty slept on Renekton item at the moment. So my S tier, I am bumping Sion up. Sion's been strong for a while now, and like for some 5 buff, albeit meaning like pretty like non-meaningful, this patch was quite interesting to see because you can observe the win rate difference between like all it is for the most part is you are getting access to more gold because you are more consistently getting last ticks with the sunflower item. It's always interesting to see that because those kind of buffs are always going to be relatively mid to low elo skewed. But Sion benefited from it. I have him in the S tier, not because of the change specifically. Like, Sion's been in a pretty good spot for a while now. Very hard to move out of lane. I think if you understand how to like effectively use his ult around the map, I think he's a genuinely really powerful option at the moment. You can opt into damage with like your Titanics for like builds as well, and yeah, I'd say he's a very deserving S tier pick in his current state. The rest of the S tier are still here from like the previous patch. Olaf is an incredible counter pick. I think he's been in a really good state for a while now. His ultimate is a very powerful tool and pair him alongside an enchanter, and it is really, really hard to take this pick down. Singed is like the niche option of the S tier at the moment. Like, he's been in a pretty strong spot for a while now. Even with the tick rate changes they made to him not too long ago, and then like for others to follow that up, he's still performing quite well, still deserving of an S tier pick. Kayle is the like sacrificing early game agency for lots of late game power. Kayle's been in a really good spot for a while now. In mid lane, she converts better into higher MMR brackets. In top lane, she's a bit more mid to low elo skewed, where you aren't going to be as consistently punished. The higher up you go, people will punish you a bit more in the longer lane and dive you more consistently. But she's still a really, really good pick. Like, as a counter pick as well, I think she's one of the best options in the top lane at the moment. Set and Mordekaiser are both really strong still. Set is like your AD option, Mordekaiser your AP option, which can now opt into AD builds if you want to on this pick. I think there's a bit of flexibility in that regard, and I would always recommend running Ignite in most matchups as Mordekaiser. This like Ignite's difference, like Ignite TP difference on Mordekaiser is really, really meaningful. Like, it's so interesting to see that being able to guarantee a takedown within your ultimate and being able to use that power to like either do more damage within a fight or being able to just guarantee that power is really, really impactful. So really something to look at, especially if you play the champion. And then I got the champion, which obviously I'm most well known for playing. I still recommend this like the top of the S tier. I think he's incredibly good for mid to low elo brackets where people won't punish you consistently, like at your weakest points of the game. And if you understand your breakpoints, your item breakpoints, your level breakpoints, he's so strong and such a clear it has such clear conditions to like succeed on this pick. I think he is still going to be my definitive like S tier option, like top of the S tier option as of the moment. So those are my thoughts. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.